Hello, boys and girls. Today we're going to read chapter 10 and chapter 11 in George's Marvelous Medicine. We just figured out a way that this medicine is really going to help. The animals are going to become bigger, which causes them to lay bigger eggs, produce more meat, have more wool, all of those things. And the story continues. So chapter 10 is A Crane for Grandma. Grandma, from high up on the rooftop, could see everything that was going on, and she didn't like what she saw. She wanted to be the center of attention. It was all about her. And nobody was taking the slightest notice of her. George and Mr. Cranky is George's father, were running around and getting excited about the enormous animals. Mrs. Cranky was washing up in the kitchen, and Grandma was all alone on the rooftop. "Hey, you!" she yelled. "George! Get me a cup of tea this minute, you idle little beast!" "Oh, don't listen to the old goat," said Mr. Cranky. "She's stuck where she is, and it's a good thing, too." "But we can't leave her up there, Dad," George said. "What if it rains?" "George!" Grandma yelled. "Oh, you horrible little boy, you disgusting little worm! Fetch me a cup of tea at once, and a slice of currant cake." "We'll have to get her out, Dad," George said. "She won't give us any peace if we don't." Mrs. Cranky came outside, and she agreed with George. "She's my own mother," she said. "She's a pain in the neck," Mr. Cranky said. "I don't care," Mrs. Cranky said. "I'm not leaving my own mother sticking up through the roof for the rest of her life." So in the end, Mr. Cranky telephoned the crane company and asked them to send their biggest crane out to the house at once. The crane arrived 1 hour later. It was on wheels, and there were 2 men inside of it. The crane men climbed up onto the roof and put ropes under Grandma's arms, and then she was lifted right up through the roof. In a way, the medicine had done Grandma good. It had not made her any less grumpy or bad-tempered, but it seemed to have cured all of her aches and pains, and suddenly she was as frisky as a ferret. As soon as the crane had lowered her to the ground, she ran over to George's huge pony, Jack Frost, and jumped onto his back. This ancient old hag, who was now as tall as a house, then galloped about the farm on the gigantic pony, jumping over trees and sheds and shouting, "On my way, clear the deck! Stand back, all you miserable midgets, or I'll trample you to death!" and other silly things like that. But because Grandma was now much too tall to get back into the house, she had to sleep that night in the hay barn with the mice and the rats. Poor Grandma. Okay, chapter 11, Mr. Cranky's Great Idea. The next day, George's father came down to breakfast in a state of greater excitement than ever. "I've been awake all night thinking about it," he cried. "About what, Dad?" George asked him. "About your marvelous medicine, of course. We can't stop now, my boy. We must start making more of it at once. More and more and more." The giant stewing pot had been completely emptied the day before because there had been so many sheep and pigs and cows and bullocks to be dosed. "But why do we need more, Dad?" George asked. "We've done all of our own animals, and we've made Grandma feel as frisky as a ferret, even though she does have to sleep in the barn." "My dear boy," said Mr. Killycranky, "we need barrels and barrels of it, tons and tons, and then we will sell it to every farmer in the world so that all of them can have giant animals. We will build a marvelous medicine factory and sell the stuff in bottles at $10 apiece. We will become rich, and you will become famous." "But wait a minute, Dad," George said. "There's no waiting," cried Mr. Cranky, working himself up so much that he put butter in his coffee and milk on his toast. "Don't you understand what this tremendous invention of yours is going to do to the world? Nobody will ever go hungry again." "Well, why won't they?" asked George. "Because one giant cow will be giving 50 buckets of milk a day," cried Mr. Cranky, waving his arms. "One giant chicken will make 100 fried chicken dinners. And 1 giant pig will give you 1,000 pork chops. It's tremendous, my dear boy. It's fantastic. It will change the world. But wait a minute, Dad, George said again. Don't keep telling me to wait a minute, shouted Mr. Cranky. There isn't a minute to wait. We must get cracking at once. Do calm down, my dear, Mrs. Cranky said from the other end of the table, and stop putting marmalade on your cornflakes. To heck with my cornflakes, cried Mr. Cranky, leaping up from his chair. Come on, George, let's get going. And the first thing we'll do is make 1 stew pot full as a tester. But, Dad, said little George, the trouble is... Oh, there won't be any trouble, my boy, cried Mr. Cranky. How can there possibly be any trouble? All you've got to do is put the same stuff in the pot as you did yesterday, and while you're doing it, I'll write down each and every item. And that's how we will get the magic recipe. But, Dad, George said, please listen to me. Why don't you listen to him? Mrs. Cranky said. The boy's trying to tell you something. But Mr. Cranky was so excited, too excited to listen to anyone except himself. And then he cried, when the new mixture is ready, we'll test it out on an old hen just to make sure we've got it right. And after that, we'll all shout hooray and build the giant factory. But, Dad, come on then. What is it you want to say? I can't possibly remember all the hundreds of things I put into the pot to make the medicine, George said. Oh, of course you can, my dear boy, cried Mr. Cranky. I'll help you. I'll jog your memory. You'll get it in the end, and you see if you don't. Now then, what was the very first thing you put in? I went up to the bathroom first, George said. I used a lot of things in the bathroom and on Mummy's dressing table. Come on then, cried Mr. Cranky. Up we go to the bathroom. And when they got there, they found, of course, a whole lot of empty tubes and empty aerosol cans and empty bottles. That's great, said Mr. Cranky. That tells us exactly what you used. If anything is empty, that means you used it. So Mr. Cranky started making a list of everything that was empty in the bathroom. And then they went to Mrs. Cranky's dressing table. A box of powder, said Mr. Cranky, writing it down. Helga's hair set, flowers of turnip perfume. Terrific, this is going to be easy. Where did you go next? To the laundry room, George said. But are you sure you haven't missed anything up here, Dad? That's up to you, my boy, Mr. Cranky said. Have I? I don't think so, George said. So down they went to the laundry room, and once again Mr. Cranky wrote down the names of all the empty bottles and cans. My goodness me, what a mass of stuff you used, he cried. No wonder it did its magic things. Is that the lot? No, Dad, it's not, George said, and he led his father out to the shed where the animal medicines were kept and showed him the 5 big empty bottles up on the shelf. Mr. Cranky wrote down all of their names. Anything else? Mr. Cranky asked. Little George scratched his head and thought, but he couldn't remember having anything else in. Mr. Killicranky leapt into his car and drove down to the village and bought new bottles and tubes and cans of everything on his list. And he then went to the vet and got a fresh supply of all the animal medicines George had used. Now, show me how you did it, George, he said. Come along, show me exactly how you mixed them all together. Okay, that was chapter 11. I hope that his medicine turns out. What do you think? See you later. Thanks for listening.